Hello, welcome to Story Time with Jen. Today, we're going to be reading Tom Thumb's Travels. This story tells the adventures of Tom Thumb, a boy no bigger than a thumb who has appeared for centuries under many names in fairy tales and nursery rhymes of various cultures. In the Grimm's collection, the character, originally called Thumbling, appears in two tales that playfully invert the classic epic of the globe-trotting hero in the mold of Homer's Ulysses. Tiny, clever, and cheeky, Tom Thumb sets out to experience life on his own. The fast-paced tale entertains with episode after episode of folly and farce in his supersized world where danger lurks around every corner, as do plenty of opportunities to outwit the lumbering humans overhead. In Tom Thumb's world, his petite size is not a disadvantage, but an impetus to ingenuity, exemplified in his repurposing a coin into a glider and similar creative maneuvers. As a popular character in folklore for hundreds of years, Tom Thumb has endeared audiences with his tenacious spirit and unlikely heroism. The Grimms noted that versions of his character date back to ancient Greece, and folklorists Iona and Peter Opie have confirmed that tales of being swallowed, a fate that befalls Tom Thumb, can be found in Europe, India, and Japan. Once there was a tailor who had a son who was very much on the short side. In fact, he was no bigger than a thumb and was so called Tom Thumb. Even though he was so small, he was a gutsy fellow and said to his father, "Father, I feel I have to go out into the world." "You're right, my son," said the old man, who took a sewing needle and made a little handle on the end of it with melted sealing wax. "And here you have a sword to take with you on your way." Our little tailor wanted to have one last home-cooked meal and skittered into the kitchen to see what his mother was cooking. The meal was ready, and his bowl was keeping warm on the hearth. "Mother, what are we having to eat today?" he asked. "Well, take a look for yourself," she said. So Tom Thumb leapt onto the hearth and peered into the bowl. But he had stretched his neck out a bit too far, and the steam rising from the food lifted him up into the chimney, and he rode the hot air for some time before he finally sank back to earth. Now the little fellow was out in the big wide world. He wandered around and eventually became an apprentice with a master tailor. But there, the food was not good enough for him. "Mrs. Taylor, if you don't give us better victuals," said Tom Thumb one day, "I will leave, and tomorrow morning I'll be back to write on your door in white chalk, 'Too many potatoes and too little meat. Off Wildershire, Potato Queen.'" "You've got some nerve, you little grasshopper," she said, getting mad, and she grabbed a rag and tried to swat him with it. But our little tailor slipped nimbly under her thimble. Then he looked out from underneath and stuck out his tongue. The master's wife picked up the thimble and tried to snatch him, but little Tom Thumb hopped onto the rag first. As she unfolded it to try and find him, he jumped into a crack in the table. "Yoo-hoo, Mrs. Taylor," he called out, poking his head out, and when she tried to squash him, he dove into the drawer. But finally she cornered him and chased him out of the house. So he roamed around once more until he came to a great forest. There he ran into a band of robbers who were planning to steal the king's treasure. When they saw Tom Thumb, they thought, "Well, such a tiny little thing can crawl right through the keyhole and be our picklock." "Hey, you giant Goliath," one of them called out. "How'd you like to come with us to the king's treasure room? You can crawl inside and hand the money to us." Tom Thumb thought for a moment, finally agreed, and went with them to the treasury. There, he searched the door up and down for a crack, and before long he found one just wide enough to crawl through. He was just about to wriggle through the crack when one of the watchmen at the door noticed him and said to the other, "What kind of awful spider is that crawling over there? I'm going to squash it." "Well, let the poor little thing be," said the other. "It hasn't done you any harm." Just then, Tom Thumb slipped safely through the crack into the treasury, opened the window, and began tossing one silver coin after another to the robbers below. He had just begun to work at a solid clip when he heard the king coming to check on his treasure, and so he dashed into hiding. The king noticed instantly that some of his silver currency was missing, but he could not fathom how that could be. The door had been tightly bolted, and as usual, everything was kept under lock and key. The king left the room and said to the two watchmen, "Well, be on your guard. There is someone after my money." Once Tom Thumb resumed his work, the watchman could hear the sound of the money moving and clinking inside. Cling, clang, cling, clang. They burst in, thinking they would catch the thief red-handed. But our little tailor had heard them coming and was too quick for them. He scampered into a corner and took cover under a coin, and he began to tease the watchman, calling out, "Here I am!" They ran towards the voice, but by the time they got there, he was already hiding under a coin in another corner. He called out, "Yoo-hoo, here I am!" The watchman hurried over, but Tom Thumb was long gone, and from a third corner he teased, "Yoo-hoo, here I am!" Again and again he made fools of them and had them running in circles around the treasury until they were worn out and finally left. He was then able to get back to work, tossing the coins one after the other out the window. He heaved the very last one with all his might, then leapt onto it and flew out the window on its face. How the robbers sang his praises! "You're a real hero," they exclaimed. "Do you want to be our leader?" Tom Thumb thanked them kindly, but said his plan was to see the world first. They divvied up their loot, and Tom Thumb asked for only one small coin, since that was all he could carry. He strapped on his sword again, bade the robbers farewell, and set off on his own two little legs. He worked as an apprentice to several different masters, but had little appetite for the work. Finally, he was hired as a servant boy at an inn, but the maids could not stand him, since he always saw the mischief they were up to without their knowing he was even there, and he would tell the owners what they stole from the guest plates and took for themselves from the cellar. "Well, just you wait. We'll teach you a lesson," they snapped, for they planned to play a prank on him. A short while later, when one of the maids was mowing the garden and saw Tom Thumb jumping up and down through the weeds, she mowed him right up with the grass, bundled up the cuttings in a tower, and secretly fed it all to the cattle. There was a big black cow among them, and she swallowed Tom Thumb along with the grass without hurting him. But he did not like it down inside her at all, since it was terribly dark and there was not a single candle burning anywhere. While the cow was being milked, Tom Thumb called out, "Strip, strap, stroll, isn't the bucket already full?" But the sound of the milking was so loud that no one could hear him. Soon the innkeeper came to the stall and said, "Tomorrow, that cow is to be slaughtered." Understandably, this made Tom Thumb quite afraid, and he cried out in a shrill voice, "Let me out! I'm stuck inside!" The man heard this, but did not know where the voice was coming from. "Where are you?" he asked. "In the black one," Tom Thumb answered. Yeah, but the man did not understand what that could possibly mean, and he walked away. Indeed, the next morning the cow went to the slaughterhouse. Fortunately, Tom Thumb did not suffer during the chopping and hacking that followed. Instead, he ended up among the sausage meat. As the butcher came over to begin his work, our little man screamed at the top of his lungs, "Don't hack so deep! Don't hack so deep! I'm right down here within the meat!" But not a soul could hear his cries over the noisy chopping. Now, he was in dire straits, but his panic gave him strength, and our fellow ran and hopped right through the army of chopping knives and got through without a nick. But even so, he could not escape entirely, since he couldn't see a clear way out, and so he got stuffed into a blood sausage with the last pieces of meat. These new quarters were really very tight, and to add to his predicament, he was hung out in the smokehouse, where time seemed to stand still. He wasn't taken down until winter, when his sausage was to be served to a guest. The minute the innkeeper's wife began to slice it, Tom Thumb had to take great care not to stretch his neck out too far, lest he lose his head. Finally, seeing the light of day, he seized the moment and burst right out of the sausage. He had no desire to stay in the house where he had been treated so poorly, so he struck out again on his journey. But his newfound freedom was not to last very long. Out in the open fields, he crossed paths with a fox, who snapped him up without a second thought. "Hey, Mr. Fox!" cried the little tailor. "It's me who's stuck in your throat. Let me out!" "You're right," answered the fox. "You're hardly the meal I was looking for. Promise me the chickens in your father's yard, and I'll let you out." "I'd be more than happy to," said Tom Thumb. "I promise you every chicken in the coop." So the fox let him out and even carried him home. When the father saw his little boy again, he gladly gave the fox all the chickens he owned. "It's not all a loss, father," said Tom Thumb. "In return, here's a nice piece of silver I brought you." And he handed his father the small coin he had earned along the way. Why, oh, why did that fox get to eat those poor chirping chickens, you might ask? Ha ha! You silly. Your father, too, would be much happier to have his child home than to have all the chickens in the yard. The end. And that's it for today's episode of Storytime with Jen. We will see you tomorrow.